We are getting started. Please take your seats and welcome to the third final panel of our workshop. I mean the third panel, but it's not. Yeah. Okay, let me get the title. Okay, the title of this panel is Mission and Syncretism in the Armenian Catholic Encounter. And our discussant is Cesare Santus, whom I already introduced, but I will just remind you that he teaches early modern history at the University of Trieste in Italy, specializes in the missionary expansion of early modern Catholicism, the inquisitorial control of religious minorities, and the relationship between the Catholic Church and Christian East.
Thank you. So I will introduce at this point Bogdan Pavlish, who is our commoner, and he is Manurian postdoctoral fellow in Armenian history here at the University of Michigan and Arbor. He earned his PhD in history from Northwestern University in 2024 with a dissertation entitled Nothing Exotic But Ourselves, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Armenian Diaspora of Poland, Lithuania in the 17th Century. He works now, I think, on the development of this dissertation in a book on the connected histories between of the Armenians of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And today he will speak. He will speak of Crafty Virgins, Credulous Kings, Faith and Deceit in Armenian Catholic Theatre in 17th century Lviv. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cesare. Let me get this. Okay, so I'll try to keep it really brief. I hope most of you read my paper. Loud, but brief. Okay, is it loud enough? Great. So this is my sort of little prehistory. This is my really very first draft of this paper. It's like a side project for my dissertation. I was writing about this mission to Armenians of Lithuania and discovered these two plays that were written in the mid-17th century, and I wanted to sort of engage with them a little more than just sort of contextually, historically, and I started writing about it, and I got carried away, and I got this text written, which doesn't really fit into my dissertation, which is more of a social religious history, and this is more. I was trying to, I guess, to pretend to be a literary critic a little bit in this one, but anyway, so this is okay. A little bit of context. We already mentioned a lot about Poland-Lithuania. So this is the map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the most precisely in the it's 16th, 17th centuries, but it's very much located in the mid-17th century with a lot of events marked here on the map. And the city of Lviv is here. This is where the Armenians had their main colony in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and where the mission was established in 1664. Few words about the mission. So that was the attempt to complete the union between the Armenians of Poland, Lithuania, and the Roman Church. The union was originally concluded by the Archbishop Torosovich in 1630, but he was the only one who actually sort of embraced the union. The rest of the community didn't like the idea, and they were opposing the attempts to change the Armenian rite and to acknowledge the authority of the Pope. So there was the need for the Catholic Church to send missionaries to sort of introduce liturgical and other sort of ritual reforms in the community. So the religious life of the community corresponded with the professed beliefs in the sort of one Catholic doctrine. And the missionaries were the Theatines, a very sort of obscure order that was established at the beginning of the Counter-Reformation, along with the Jesuits. So it was one of the sort of major Counter-Reformation orders. And at some point, they were leading the way in missionizing Armenians a little bit in the Middle East, but mostly in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here I like this plate of Clemento Galano. It's from the 18th century, because the author of this caption got so many things wrong about him. So I was curious how confusing Galano's geography was to the author of this plate, because it says that he established the mission for Ruthenians, which is not really the case. It was a mission for Armenians, but in Ruthenia, in Sarmatia, in Poland, he also says that he converted Patriarch Cyril, but our Greek Patriarch Cyril, but it was actually Armenian Patriarch of Constantinople named Kyriakos. So there are many other things. He's also named the professor of Armenian chair in propaganda college. So maybe he was the first professor of Armenian studies in the West. So, anyways, the mission was originally pretty successful, and they did achieve the change of the major liturgical rites of the Armenian Church in the first 2 years, October 1666, and then they started to sort of publicize their achievements and to make the union more lasting. And this is when the theater affair emerged, and eventually it started as a sort of an attempt to persuade local Armenians that the Theatines actually teach classical Armenian at the college that they opened in Lviv, because the locals didn't believe them, although they themselves didn't speak classical Armenian. So that was like a very interesting conversation going on. But anyway, so one of the missionaries, Louis-Marie Pidou, who was French, who was the student of Galano, he decided to stage these, like a big performance of a tragedy, religious tragedy in classical Armenian. And he wrote this one. It was the first one, Saint Ripsime, Virgin and Martyr, or Tridat, the Transfigured or Transformed. So it was written simultaneously in a number of languages. It was classical Armenian for the text of the play. The intermezzi were in Polish, and these leaflets were also in Polish. They sort of gave a very short description of the play. And then there was also a Latin translation of this play, which was sent to Rome because there was a controversy over the whole thing. Some Armenian priests didn't like the idea of staging religious tragedies, and maybe in the way Pidou did it, and so they complained to Propaganda Fide that they were misusing money for some comedy performances. They called them comedies, and so Pidou had to prove himself right. And so there was this whole exchange that, luckily for us, gave us a lot of information about the first performance of this play. We know that there was also even a sort of a set of decorations made by local artisans that represented Armenia with the Mount of Ararat, and Rome with 7 hills. And at some points, this whole construction was sort of moved around the stage. There was this like whole Baroque thing about the stage equipment. And so they were trying to really impress the audience, and they apparently did, but not all of them, because I feel like a lot of Armenians were not very comfortable with the play and its message. And I'm trying to discuss this in my paper, where I show this very interesting reinterpretation of the story of Saint Ripsime, Saint Gaiane, and the Roman virgins and their role in the conversion of Armenia to Christianity. I sort of focus on their use of religious dissimulation as a sort of vehicle to show the sort of the deceit of paganism in pre-Christian Armenia, and also as a vehicle of conversion of Armenia eventually to Christianity, which is very different from the hagiographical narrative that is very sort of traditional and heroic struggle of the virgins against Terdat, who is like portrayed as a tyrant, sort of trying to rape Saint Ripsime. There's this whole very well-known narrative, and it's a completely different sort of story in this way. And in this leaflet, there's also a list of students who played, and like all the actors. These are actual students of the college, all the local Armenians from different places. Actually, you can see also they're from Kamenets, from Yazlovets, from Lublin, other places. Some of them became, like Vartan Hunanyan became archbishop, and Deodat Nersasovic, there's another one here too. So anyways, and then there was another place, Saint Pulcheria, Virgin and Empress, or the deaths of Theodosius the Younger. And this one is very historical. It really follows the historical events of the Byzantine history, that like mid-5th century, right before the Council of Chalcedon, very closely. And it's really hard to to reinterpret it on my own terms as I would like to, because it follows the sort of the historical narrative very closely. But in this one, in my analysis, I sort of, this is the title page of the Latin translation, because this one I think survived only in Latin translation. I didn't really find any references to classical Armenian. And this is from Krakow. It's a very bad quality preserved manuscript. But again, in this manuscript, there is an interesting sort of tension between sort of this, not necessarily simulation, but like between secrecy and transparency in this sort of struggle between heresy and orthodoxy at the Byzantine court. And it's interesting how the introduction of heresy is portrayed as the work of basically political intrigues between different factions at the Byzantine court, which made me draw some parallels with the missionaries' own approach to missionizing Armenians in Poland, Lithuania. And I just here want to mention that these two plays, they sort of echo the same logic of the spread of heresy or like in general religious change in the Armenian church that Galano portrayed in his treatise about the history of the Armenian and Catholic churches. He also argues that all the major heresies were introduced through some meddling of external forces, especially Arab and Persian authorities, who cooperated with some very evil sort of church prelates of the Armenian church, who then introduced introduced new practices that were different from the Catholic Orthodoxy. And I have like a couple questions about like this whole, I don't know, construction. I don't know how far-fetched it is, but I think it's pretty sort of coherent. And I was wondering, I think I need to have like a more smooth transition from my discussion of the place back to the practice of the missionaries on the ground and how it related to their own actions, because they also used a lot of these like methods of religious dissimulation, political intrigues, like secret negotiations with different factions of the Armenian community to make them accept their conditions of the union. So it made me think about all these issues and how much theater, in this sense, is sort of a reflection, or maybe the source of these ideas, how people can change their beliefs, how some new practices or new teachings can be introduced. Yeah, and that's basically it. Yeah, thank you. Oh, sorry.
So Daniel Ohanian is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, Los Angeles. He specializes in early modern and modern Ottoman Armenian history and has published several articles in this field. And his dissertation, which is much awaited, I must say, at least from me, focuses on the spread of Roman Catholicism among Ottoman Armenians around 1700 and the imprisonment in France of the anti-Catholic Archbishop Patriarch Avedik of Tokat. The floor is yours.
So before assembling here, we were talking about running this last panel as closer to a conversation, more different from a Q&A. And so I'm going to say just a few things, and I'm going to go from the specifics of my paper to more general things. And I want to present my ideas in a way where I expect those who are interested will pull on a thread and will decide where the conversation goes. So Cesare told you a couple of things about my dissertation. Indeed, it's about the spread of Roman Catholicism among the Ottoman Armenian population around 1700. As I've been working on this topic, I've realized that this research has to be done by looking at a few different themes, by approaching it from a few very different angles. I have a chapter in my dissertation, which I have not circulated, that focuses on French-Ottoman geopolitics. That's one thing. I think that it's necessary for us to understand that aspect if we want to understand the history of the spread of Catholicism among Armenians and the reactions to that spread. Another chapter is also completely distinct. It has to do with the role of money, and especially moneyed lay people who are merchants, and their ability through their mercantile wealth to back pro and anti-Catholic bishops according to their denominational desires. Totally different from geopolitics. Finally, I have a pair of chapters, and the paper that I circulated is a in-progress draft of one of those pairs. I have a pair of chapters that focuses on printed books and the way that book printing overlapped with the spread of Catholicism and the reactions to that spread. The chapter that I've circulated is taking a sort of top-down, relatively speaking, elite perspective. It's looking at how did specific people who are in a position to be able to author, translate, and publish books, what is it that they wanted to do with respect to Catholicism and anti-Catholicism? One half of that chapter looks at a man called Krikor of Merzifon. He was an anti-Catholic. He published particular kinds of books in order to push back against the work of Armenian Catholic and French Catholic missionaries. Another half of the chapter works on a press that we can somewhat ethically call the Holy Echmiadzin and Subsarchis the General Press. This was an Armeno-Catholic operation that put different kinds of books into circulation. These books were meant to support Armenian Catholics, and they were meant to do missionary work, which is to say, for me, salvific work, naturally, from a more or less Roman Catholic perspective. The final chapter in my dissertation, which I did not circulate, looks at things from the bottom up. It looks at printed books, but it looks at who was able to read books, who was literate. It looks at the concepts of semi-literacy and full literacy. It identifies the fact that some Armenians belong to one category, others to the second, and some to none at all. And it makes the argument that from a reader's perspective, not every book that was printed by a Catholic or that was printed by an anti-Catholic would have been read in the way that it was intended. And this is something we can tell when we look at a particular text. And if we put aside the denominational affiliation of its producer, we see that many of these texts actually were generally Christian in some sense, and that you have to be a very nuanced reader to be able to figure out that, oh yeah, this is clearly the work of a Frank. This was clearly the work of an Italian. For most readers, those types of things wouldn't have been obvious, and if they were obvious, I don't think that they would have mattered actually very much. That's an overview of the dissertation and the kinds of things that have interested me. Like I said, I presented them in such a way where people can pick whatever thread they want to pick at, and we can talk in that way. I'll say a couple of things about the chapter that was circulated, a couple of more things and the major themes in it, which we might find interesting. I thought that going off of that text, we might be able to talk about what the word term confession, confessionalization does for us, if anything. I think that words generally bias our thinking, not necessarily in negative ways, but they shape our thinking. It's shaped my thinking, for instance, in complex ways. So that's perhaps something we could discuss. Another thing I thought that we might want to discuss, if it's of interest, is the following sort of thing that's come out to me by looking at printed books. When I started doing this work, I was thinking a lot about orthodoxy, having the right beliefs, and I was thinking about orthopraxy, the emphasis on people acting out religion in the ways that are prescribed. A word that I hadn't thought about very much at all, but that really jumped out at me as I was reading these books was orthopathy, having the correct emotions. it seems to me that a huge part of what Armeno-Catholic printers, writers, and translators were doing was they weren't interested in orthodoxy or orthopraxy almost at all, I would argue. There was an intense emphasis on orthopathy, producing texts that fully literate Armenians would be able to read to feel the correct types of emotions. In these lines, there's much more that I can say, different kinds of themes that I can pull out on. But again, because we want this to go as a conversation as opposed to Q&A, I'll leave it there. And I'll leave it there.
So I will start with you, and then okay. So we can go on this conversation. Okay, I will refer particularly to the paper, at least to what I read. So Daniel's paper focuses on a fundamental historical turning point, which has been studied in great depth, but still has some unclear points that need to be explored. So, for example, let's start with the historical actors. Daniel rightly focused on the Armenians who revolved around the two rival printing houses of Surbech-Miatzin and Surb-Sargis-Zoravar on the one hand, and of Grigor Marzdanitsy on the other. And the first observation that comes to my mind is that in the setting up of these printing houses in the Ottoman capital, there is an issue that is sometimes underestimated, namely the role of the technical know-how, of the transfer of technologies necessary for printing. To produce books like the ones Daniel talked about, you need a very high level of technical expertise, which at that time was mostly the preserve of European printers. And in fact, from at least two somewhat elusive mentions, we know that the Surbech-Miatzin printing house was, supervised by the Armenians mentioned in your paper, so Sargis Saidchi, Michitar Sebastatsi, Petros of Tiflis, Kachatur Arakelian, and many others. But its technical equipment was run by an European professional. According to the report left by a French traveler, Aubry de la Motret, I translate the quote, in 1704 the Armenians brought fresh complaints against the Jesuits, whom they accused of being disturbers of the faithful subjects of the port. They also leveled accusations against a Provençal named Solomon, alleging that he was printing seditious books in Armenian in Pera under the protection of the ambassador. These books, it was claimed, sought to corrupt the faithful and draw them away from obedience to their spiritual and temporal superiors. As a result, the storm fell upon this printer, who was forced to close his shop. Afterward, he disappeared and remained in hiding until a new vizier was appointed. And prior to these events, he had taken the precaution of securing his tools, types, and presses in a safe location. End of the quote. So who was this mysterious French printer who was running, actually, the Surbech-Miatzin printing house, at least from a technical point of view? We know nothing about him. I know nothing about him, apart that 2 years earlier, according to another testimony, he was working for the embassy of Holland, not France. But no more than that. This is to say that there's still more to discover, and I'm sure that in your dissertation you will shed a new light on this. Moving to a more general remark, I'm not sure whether some concepts that you use, like adhesive conversion or syncretism, are entirely suited to the context illustrated in your dissertation, because it's undeniably true that the publication of the Surbech-Miatzin printing press did not aim to erase Armenian traditions, but rather sought to build upon them. That's true. However, this approach was precisely the method adopted by the majority of Catholic missionaries, and if I may add, it was the near-official strategy of the Roman Church in its dealings with the Christianists in early modern times. Because while Protestant practices and doctrines could be outright dismissed by Catholic authorities as bad innovations, we may say, the same approach could not be applied to those communities who were regarded rightly or wrongly, as the heirs of ancient Christianity, the inhabitants of the Holy Land, etc., etc. So within the early modern Catholic intellectual framework, the liturgical or theological differences of the Eastern churches with Rome were explained as due to the degeneration brought about by the passing of time, by the ignorance of the Eastern clergy, to the influence of a few heresiarchs who had spread errors among faithful who were once perfectly Orthodox, etc. And from this perspective, Catholic missionaries saw their own mission as bringing the Eastern churches back into their original supposed union of faith and ecclesiastical communion with Rome. So their task was to help these communities rediscover their authentic past and customs rather than replacing them with Latin ones. And this is why Rome financed the publication of Eastern liturgical books rather than simply compelling converts to adopt Latin ones. This is why also the Surbeci Medicine Press was printing this kind of things. We may say that in order to justify its universalistic claims, Catholic, the Church of Rome voluntarily allowed a plurality of languages and rites, provided, obviously, that they remained within the boundaries set by the Holy See. So sometimes these rites needed to be corrected, in a way, censored. And this kind of perspective also accounts for the frequent references of to the Church Fathers, whose lives and works predated the doctrinal divisions between Catholics and Eastern or Oriental Orthodox, and thus could be employed to advance Rome's goals. And why I'm saying that? Because in your paper there's a reference, a very interesting reference to Gregorius Aborich, Gregory the Illuminator. And it was already mentioned before today, so I want to dwell on that. The figure of Saint Gregory the Illuminator presents a particularly intriguing case study, because between the 17th and 18th centuries, the saint was used both as a tool of anti-Catholic polemic. You demonstrated it very well in analyzing Gregor Marzvanetzi and his publications, but also as an instrument of Catholic apostolate, the same person used in two different opposing ways. In fact, this latter use, so the Catholic use of Gregor, is even earlier, since the Church of Rome had long sought to sustain the medieval legend of the meeting and alliance between Pope Sylvester, Gregory the Illuminator, Emperor Constantine, and King Theodat. So, as late as 1683, one of the most zealous Armenian Catholic missionaries, Hovhannes of Lviv, Hovhannes of Constantinople, a guy who could hardly be accused of syncretic tendencies, he oversaw the publication in Venice of the fabricated letter of love and concord, Tucht Siroyev Miabanutian. And this document purported to testify to an ancient and perpetual alliance between the Armenian Church and the Church of Rome, as symbolized by the figure of Saint Gregory the Illuminator. So, to me, it is fascinating to question why the representatives of the Apostolic Church, such as Gregor Marzvanetzi or Patriarch Avedik or others, focused on Gregory the Illuminator in their efforts to find a reference point in shaping a specific confessional anti-Catholic identity. Why did they not choose more unambiguously divisive and anti-Catholic figures such as Hovhannes Oznetsi or Gregor Tatevatsi? So obviously they chose a prestigious figure, but also somewhat equivocal in this from a confessional point of view, we may say. It's a curiosity, but I wonder whether understanding this choice might shed light on the broader strategies and tensions of the period. This is my general remarks. I'm not sure. Do we? So I turn to Bogdan, and then we make a general discussion. Okay. So turning to Bogdan's paper, I found it very interesting to read a detailed analysis of the martyrdom of Saint Ripsime, a text that, while superficially well known, at least since one of the first Armenologists, Antoine Jean Saint-Martin, presented it in the Journal Asiatique in 1823. So it has been known, but rarely studied in depth, particularly in terms of its contextualization. First of all, Bogdan's use of sources from the Propaganda Fide archive helps to definitely clarify the authorship of the tragedy, because it is traditionally attributed to Louis-Marie Pidou, but, for example, it has been mistakenly credited by the Mekhitarist scholar Tashan in his catalog of the Vienna manuscripts to an elusive Alexianos. So who was this Alexianos? The misunderstanding, and there's some historiography saying this work is by Alexianos. So I guess that the misunderstanding arose from a confusion over Pidou's first name, which was rendered in Latin as Aloysius. So Aloysius Alexianus, that's my guess. The text itself was brought from Lviv to Venice by a missionary, and it was preserved in Venice in the Theatine convent of San Nicolò da Tolentino. And then, following the suppression of the convent in 1811, the manuscript was transferred to the Marciana National Library, where it remains today. And it has been published in installments in Basmavep between 1884 and 1886. So Bogdan widely chooses to compare in his paper this text to another near contemporary work, the tragedy of Saint Pulcheria, which is now preserved in Krakow. But in fact, Pidou's students at the Armenian College in Lviv performed several plays, not just these two, during the 1660s. But as far as I know, we know just the titles of the others. So we have The Death of Caesar, The Proverbs of Solomon, The Death of Herod, but we might just speculate about their content. In the two surviving tragedies, Bogdan emphasizes a theme that is both characteristic of the Baroque literary and cultural style, to which these works belong, and at the same time reflective of the social and political context in which they were performed. That is, internal dissension, or, as he terms it, schism. This theme is especially significant as the concept of being in between or divided between two worlds has long characterized the history of the Armenian people. The Armenians are between East and West, Asia and Europe, the Iranian and Greek world, the Sasanian and Roman empires, the Safavid and the Ottoman spheres, and so on. And for early modern Armenian Catholics in particular, the notion of division, internal division, but not just internal, became, according to me, a defining category. So Armenian Catholic faithful at the time were not only divided internally, experiencing nearly constant scruples of conscience, moral doubts due to the transgressions of Catholic norms, which they were often forced to make because of the logic of community life, or especially in the Ottoman Empire, in this case, political affiliation. But they were also divided externally by their fellow apostolic nationals, but believers, and also sometimes they were divided by their fellow Catholics. In the 18th century, it became a common refrain among missionaries reporting to Rome that Armenian Catholics had split into different factions competing with one another. For example, with regard to the discipline to be observed in their contact with the Armenian Church, some followed the teachings of Propaganda Fide, others, mainly in Constantinople and Aleppo, turned to the Latin missionaries, others, especially in Central and Eastern Anatolia, followed the Mekhitarist. So 3 different groups and 3 different ways of behaving. The problem was that each of these 3 groups taught different things. And there's a quote, "What one admits, the other forbids." Not to mention the internal dissensions bordering on psychopathology that sometimes occurred among Armenians sent to study in Rome, some of whom ended up internalizing a fanatical approach that went beyond what Catholic authorities required. In some cases, they even Latinized their way of writing in Armenian, so creating this strange language, which it's Armenian, but with a Latin grammar or Latin loanwords. and they fostered a generalized suspicion of their fellow countrymen. So seeing threats of schism and occult heresy almost everywhere. This is the case of Barseghian and others. So I do not wish to delve too deeply into this kind of remote psychologization, which is always problematic, but I wonder whether it is necessary to explore this aspect more fully. And it is related to the psychological analysis of the characters of the play that you made in your paper. Because normally historians focus more on facts and ideas, doctrines, than on emotions and movements of the soul, but these have their place. Returning to the tragedy staged in Lviv in 1688, I wonder whether it is just a chance that the most split character of all, King Tiridates, which is completely split in itself, really, was portrayed on stage by Bogdan Ohanian, who later became Torosovic's successor at the head of the Catholic Armenians of Poland, but experienced all the time, since the very beginning, a very difficult relationship with the Torozovics and in general with the Armenian hierarchy. He was all the time contested, experienced a lot. He was imprisoned at a certain point, etc. So yeah, these are just impressionistic comments, but this is what it came to my mind. And once again, I congratulate both authors on their excellent papers and give you the floor.
Hey, thank you so much, Cesare. It's such a treasure to have you as a commenter on our papers. I didn't really know that the manuscript of the play is in Marciana Library. It's not at San Lazzaro?
No.
No? Oh, so there is a chance to see the manuscript. Yeah. Okay. Because I was using the published version in Basmoveb. I like that your approach to this, and I feel really sympathetic to what you said about the sort of the danger of psychologizing historical events and actors, but also the need to somehow deal with these issues that sometimes we see in the sources, but we're not able to go beyond what we have in the sources. And in this sense, it was very liberating to write this paper, because I was able to psychologize however I wanted, because I was writing about the play and about all these characters. And then I didn't like try to tie it so closely to the reality, but at the same time, I sort of alluded to these possible reflections of similar dilemmas, similar struggles that the missionaries faced, but also that Armenians faced. And I really like your comparison of King Tridat to Vartan Hunanyan. I didn't really pay attention to this, that he played Vartan Hunanyan. But I was also thinking about this other character, Prince Karen, who is also like a very interesting completely fictional character, but I felt like it was a very eloquent sort of representation maybe of the Armenians in Poland, Lithuania, in Lviv, and maybe in other places that were struggling with this choice between the ancestral tradition and the new religion. But King Tridat is also definitely probably part of that mood in the play. About Alexianos, I've never heard Alexianos. I've never heard of the name and never encountered it in the documents from at that time. So I assume it might be a mistake, because usually Louis Marie Pidou was named Alois Marie Pidou. And I feel like this, at least the argument that I was alluding to, it sort of dovetails with what you told in the morning about the first sort of stage of missionization as sort of trying to convert peacefully and not sort of aggressively at first, at least. Although at this point you can see that there are some elements of this more comprehensive sort of conversion or union in Lviv, especially because when they're trying to change the rituals, they're trying to control the social and religious beliefs more strongly. But I feel like they're still working within this more open-ended paradigm of mission and union. Thank you so much for the comments.
Thank you, Cesare. I'll say something about La Motre maybe after this. These are fine historical details. And thank you for your pushing back, which I really appreciate about syncretism and adhesion. I'm going to think about it. My first reaction is to push back against your pushback, but I often find that that's unhealthy and that one should take some time to digest criticism, because then you find out actually that that your own thinking has to be, you have to let go a bit. But let me say a couple of things about Kriko Lusavoric by way of sort of educating all of us and thinking a bit out loud. I don't know. So the question that Cesare raised, right, is kind of like, Kriko Lusavoric was a sort of ambiguous figure, perhaps, and so then why would a belligerent anti-Catholic like Kriko of Marzavan not publish a work by someone who was much easier to categorize and identify? I wonder how much of a say he had in the matter. I'll share the story that resulted in the publication of that book. In 1905, 1906, the Patriarch of Istanbul is kidnapped and he's sent away. Anti-Catholic Armenians take issue with this, and they write a letter to the Gatoegos in Echmiadzin, Alexander of Julfa. And in that letter, they say all sorts of things, anti-Catholics in Istanbul do. They say in this city, for instance, Catholics have perverted our books, but we want to let you know that there is one printer who's on our side and who's loyal to you until death, and that's Kriko of Merzifon. So that's 1706. A couple of years later, a novirag, a legate of the Gatoegos, comes to Istanbul with a manuscript and says, "Dear Krikor, this manuscript has been copied in the Gatoegos' own hand, and he would like for you to print it." And that is Agatankeros's Batmuchun. I put Batmuchun in quotes because initially I thought that Agatankeros's Batmuchun was just a straight history, but it was only very recently that I realized that actually Agathangelos' text has two halves. The first quarter is a hagiography. The middle half is a catechism, laying out the tenets of the Armenian faith, so to speak, right? But in some sort of way that was taken as authoritative by the 600s and the 700s, and then it continues back with hagiography again. And so then I wonder if Krikor printed it without thinking too much about it, because how can you say no to Gatoegos? Could be. I wonder why the Gatoegos decided to send that work. This Gatoegos had authored a virulently anti-Catholic, belligerently anti-Catholic work in Nujulfa in the 1680s already. He was in an anti-Catholic frame of mind. He had experience with debate, and probably indirectly, at least, for sure, he had experience with debating not only Catholics, but also Shia Muslims in Isfahan. And so he sends this work, and I wonder then if one of the reasons why he sends this work is because it had an Armenian catechism inside of it. That's one of the claims, at least in the paratext, that Armenians should read this and should learn about their own faith, and so on. This was a text, I'll say finally, that could have been read only by extremely expert readers around 1700, of whom there were very few. Let me leave it at that. Thank you.
So Anatol and later Amir.
I have a question for, well, I guess it's a comment question. And Daniel's bringing up of orthopanty is related to what I was going to say about what you're bringing up. Is that I wonder if you could speak more on the pedagogy of the Jesuits and Theatines that incorporated religious drama fundamentally, integrally into the way you study. And that in itself created a completely, well, of course, the Jesuits and Theatines have been running it for a while, and they saw how fruitful it was for actually developing orthopanty. because you, especially for priests, because they do not, they don't have a relation, or one would hope, with females, and therefore their ability to develop nuanced understanding of human emotions is stunted, I would say. But and I'm saying that as with my own son being in the seminary. But no. I'm not critiquing my son in any way. I'm just, I'm pointing out that I understand the like day-to-day concerns of men who are bound together and have to discuss all these emotions, which they later have to actually experience in confessionals and so forth, or teaching. And that's what I mean. Like, I'm not trying to be the kind of critiquing them. But so bringing that up brings me to that other thing that we've been discussing of fundamental difference of how Armenian church has been thus far on its own educating its clergy, and how different this approach is, and therefore how novel for the laity to see that. So I wonder if you could speak more about it, and more specific second question to it. Do we see some of the Ruthenian seminarians participating in that play? Or is it just our Armenian students? And I'm saying that as we're both conscious of the constant day-to-day logistical nightmare that the seminary in Lviv created, of basically eventually creating two entrances for two student bodies, because they would always fight with each other. I mean, lovely people.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. Actually, the Ruthenians joined the Armenians in this seminary much later, in the 18th, I think it's early 18th century, probably early 1700s. Yeah, so they didn't participate in any of. I don't think anyone participated. There are a few names in this list that don't sound like Armenian names, from what I know from the time. So I assume those might be like local, but they would be more Polish, I would say, than Ruthenian. But it's the question of emotions is really interesting because yeah, you're right. You kind of described it already very well. The sort of the major stakes of this new approach to education of the clergy, especially embraced by the Jesuits, but also kind of replicated by other orders. And this sort of emphasis on rhetoric and school theater would be part of this sort of training in public performance, in rhetoric, in sort of honing skills of public speaking in Latin and vernacular languages, and in classical Armenian in this case. And yeah, and I feel like there was also like a special. I mean, part of my argument is that there was like the special emotional appeal of this play that was supposed to be sort of instrumental in sort of showing Armenians that they should join the Catholic Church, that they should sort of reconsider their tradition more critically. And it was sort of, I mean, Pidou in one of his letters describing the reaction of Armenians to the play writes that they listened to the words of the truth with no offense, which I assume there was some offense in all of this. And also in the play, you can see how a lot of these conversions of King Trdat and Prince Karen, it happens when they are like humiliated and would like feel shame for what they were doing, and then they are like finally embracing the true faith. So there's this notion of sentimental education in the play, and another interesting aspect is that they are. The main characters are female characters, and a lot of them, and they are the major sort of drivers of these conversions, of these transformations of beliefs and religious practices, and they are played by male by male students. Although at some point, I think Peter Cowie mentioned that in one of the manuscript, there was a mention of female actors. I'm not sure about that. I didn't see the manuscript, but in all these leaflets, you can see that they are all students of the college, because that was the point of the theater. I assume they should be all students of the college, and they are playing all female parts. And these are like very sort of, a lot of them are very secular themes and like scenes that they are, some of them even including some Greek gods and deities, allegories of different virtues or emotions as well. So yeah, I would definitely see this as a problem for traditional Armenian clergy, because they are not used to this, and this is quite understandable, I would say. And that's why there were like complaints about this theater, because it was so different from what people were used to.
People wondering where the women are.
Mm-hmm.
They're there, just they're played by men. Thank you.
Thank you both. Very fascinating. Questions for Daniel. If I may ask you something about one of your chapters that you mentioned. Sort of said in passing that lobbying for different bishops obviously was motivated by money and geopolitics, and he said that both of them are distinct interests. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and the overlaps, because I can imagine that, say, an Armenian merchant would have interests with the French embassy because of their transnational relations and economic relations, so that the economic and geopolitical intersect in a way.
Thanks. The very last thing you said is very smart, very learned. One of the exciting things for me about having framed my own project the way that I did, is that a lot of things that become the reality from the mid-18th century onwards are not at all the case yet around 1700. So one of those things is what you pointed to, the overlap between Armenian merchants and the French diplomatic network is not something that exists yet in 1700. And then for the first part of your question, just to say more, basically the situation is like this. Around 1700, no clear party has the upper hand. And so you have a bunch of players who are doing their best in a situation in which they have to compromise and in which they don't have as much power, which is to say real influence, as they think perhaps that they should. So there are French diplomats backed by the French government who can't get everything done that they would like to. They back French missionaries, and that's very important, and they do it. But they also have problems with missionaries. Some of them are much too zealous and won't hold back the way diplomats feel that they should. The French diplomatic network itself exists, and it works in an important way, but it also breaks down. Consuls in particular can be very problematic. Not all of them are of a high professional quality. The ambassador in Istanbul perhaps has a nervous breakdown, and that's why he resigns, though that's unclear. And there are only very few links through money, though, between this French diplomatic network and Armenian laymen, which is that there are a couple of particular instances where French individuals living in Istanbul and Armenian lay people together pool their money to pull someone out of prison or to push someone into prison. But at this stage, those events are like, I think there are 2 or 3 times that such things happen. There's, for instance, the poet, musician, patriarch called Melchiset or Subhi, who is pro-Catholic. He's put into prison, and then a bunch of different people pool money so that he can be brought out of prison again, including missionaries and including the French Nation, the merchant community in Istanbul. In short, it's this kind of thing. There are lots of little interesting stories, but no one really is kind of strong enough to be doing everything they want all the time.
I don't know if I need that, but yeah, just to go back, of course, to Grigor Lusovodic, and whether, it's precisely because he's a contested, ambiguous figure that has to be the person that they don't pick. Let's say, I think a clearer one, they would have said like Thaddeus and Bartholomew. right? If you wanted to go against Peter and Paul, you might as well go with Thaddeus and Bartholomew. But you know, doesn't have that same punch as to have somebody who is contested and therefore recognized and accepted, right? That's the other part. So when having somebody that you're fighting over is somebody that everybody recognizes, you don't have to like fight over somebody that nobody cares about. But precisely because it is charged, I think that becomes part of that fighting field, right? And that's because they can agree upon it, right? So
I was thinking of making Gregory denominator Armenian again.
yeah, make Gregory the Illuminator, yeah. But yeah, it's a whole different. It's all that's. But Daniel, I like what you point out. That part of the reason why the Catholicos is probably sending that book is because nobody has any idea what the heck's in it, right? They don't know the story, right? They're ignorant, and that like leads into the other question where you're talking about these divided sort of feelings. How divided were, I mean, how rooted were they in something? And now I'm going to totally take an anachronistic like analogy of saying like Italian Americans in America today have these divided feelings about an Italy that doesn't exist, right, anymore, that Italians in Italy have no idea about. But they may feel this division now. And I'm wondering then like whether the Armenians in Poland who, you know, after the Council of Florence, like said, yeah, we're Catholic, and then maybe not, and then yes, and then like how divided are they? Like how rooted are they in a tradition that is different? And is that tradition from the 12th century, from the 14th century, or is it contemporary with the moment in that sense to feel that division? I'm just wondering because they're doing also all that retranslation, Stephanos Lehetzi in the 17th century and re-emerging.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the analogy is interesting, just to like sort of as a provocation. But I think they felt much more attached to the Armenian, to the Armenian Church at least, and to the rest of the Armenian diaspora than Italian Americans today to Italy. I mean, they were part of the Armenian Church. They bishops were ordained by the Catholicos. They were trained in Istanbul or in Echmiadzin or in other places. They like the manuscripts circulated from different places all over the diaspora, so they were part of the diasporic community, like wider Armenian diaspora. So in this sense, they were much closer to this, I don't know, Armenian quote unquote tradition, apostolic tradition at least. And on the other hand, they might have had more sort of openness to Catholicism because they live close to big Catholic community, to the Orthodox Ukrainian community. So they might have been, in this sense, more open to other confessions. Yeah, and just this this idea of division and how much it was not just sort of an invention of this one missionary. The good example of this is actually the Armenian priest who wrote a complaint about the play, Jacob Grigorenz. He was an Armenian priest from Constantinople who became Armenian Catholic with Galano. He was trained in Rome in 1650s, and then he ended up in Lviv with the Theatines as part of the mission. But he was, in one of his letters, he was complaining that he was not accepted by local Armenians because they called him an apostate or something like that. And then he was not also considered a fully Catholic by the missionaries because he wasn't Catholic. He didn't have the same rights as a missionary. He didn't have the same rights to celebrate the liturgy. He could celebrate Armenian Catholic liturgy, but it was like a very niche thing at the time because it wasn't accepted by the local Armenians in Lithuania. So he wrote several complaints to Rome to ask for what to do and how to make money because he was like, he couldn't make money because he couldn't serve any community with his Armenian Catholic mass. So I think he's like a good example of this, maybe a little bit staged and performed divisiveness, but still I think it was pretty real.
Michael?
Yeah.
thank you so much for another really interesting panel and just a great day of conversations. And I've learned so much today. I had a quick question out of curiosity for Daniel. And I might be misremembering, but in your paper, I think that there was an anti-Catholic figure who burns a lot of books. And then among those books is Nerses Snorhali's Jesus the Son.
Yeah.
So I was really wondering, like, why, am I remembering that right? Okay, so I was wondering why you think an anti-Catholic Armenian would burn one of the great works of medieval literature written by the Catholicos of the Armenian Church in the 12th century. Since I think of that, also it's kind of like another, I'm talking about Sergio a little bit, like pre-confessional moment, you know, where Snorhali is like constantly, even though he makes overtures to other churches, like he's constantly distinguishing, you know, Syriac churches really like this, and Syriacs are like this, and Greeks are really like this, and you know, we can laugh at them a little bit because they're not like us. You know, so there's kind of like this need to differentiate, and I'm just wondering what do you make this later moment in time that's like now done with that, but doing something else? Is there? I was going back to the conversation this morning. What's the through line of confessionalism that you see in the history of producing and destroying?
I would turn it back to you. I'd be really excited to hear why anyone thinks that book was being burned. I haven't looked at it closely, but all that's left, I'll use the mic. I'm really glad that you brought this up. I don't know the answer. I'm hoping that someone more well-versed than me might have some guesses. All I can say is that it's kind of surprising which books... Madian Vohperkuchian wasn't really published and didn't become popular in printing until the mid-18th century. In the mid-18th century, I think it's printed for the first time, maybe the second, but then it's always kept in print. Whereas Jesus Vorti is popular, is always kept in print in Eurasia from the 1640s onward. So I think that text meant something to a lot of people, but what, I have no idea. And all that's left for me to do, which I just haven't done, is I haven't checked the paratexts of the earliest editions. There might be an answer there, of course. But in like the 1702 edition or whatever that's published by Armeno-Catholics in Istanbul, there's no explanation about why they're printing it. The only other little thing that I can add is that a particular French missionary, Jacques Villot, and maybe also Galano, I'm not sure, I could check, they categorize Armenian Catholicoi in terms of whether they were Orthodox or not, and they say that Nerses the Graceful was. But this is really a clue, huh? That's it, because I don't think that the Patriarch's deputy was opening up Galano and being like, okay, and then let me now go to the bookseller. If there are any matches, then we're going to burn those. He wasn't, I mean, I guarantee you, knowing how unserious of a person he was intellectually, he was not doing that. So that's all I got. If there are any guesses, please.
Perhaps apart from the fact that Snorhali was considered as close to Catholicism, at least in this perspective, but the point perhaps was just that everything which was published by Catholics was suspicious and dangerous. So apart from the content, the very fact that a book has been published by Catholics was clear that it was intended to do some evil within the community. So
they could have changed it. Yeah. When they published it, right? I mean, not that like they did, but like they could be suspected of like.
But perhaps even without opening the book, just the idea. They have told me that this book has been printed by Catholics. I don't even open it. It's just it's a Trojan horse, in the very sense it's a weapon. So I don't want to touch it.
There is the idea, I'll say quickly, and Sergio, you brought up by saying changed. Anti-Catholic Armenians bring up more than once, and we have this in like Ottoman government orders as well, that the Catholics have perverted our texts. And I haven't gone through to look at what might have been perverted, so to speak now. But I wonder if someone wants to do that work. If there is something there that was sensitive, that was changed, that could be. And what Cesare is saying, I mean, now that I'm talking, Of course, that makes sense. Yeah, you're right. I mean, they could have just looked at the thing, the title page, right? And if it says Rome, then yeah.
But yeah, the Armenians would have been sensitive because they changed other people's work, so they know it happens, right? They throughout history, when they did these translations, they changed what was in them, and they ascribed things to, Orthodox, or from their perspective, Orthodox authors that weren't from there. So everyone's doing it, and therefore it would be like suspicious. The publishing house matters.
Can I quickly ask a follow-up, please? Please. Because I mean, since distorting scripture is such a trope in distinguishing Islam from its predecessors, do you think that's a particularly valid piece of rhetoric when you talk to the Ottomans?
I think so. So something that I've come up against is, and this really, I think, needs to be discussed kind of at length by multiple people, a critical approach to using Ottoman government materials for the history, especially of non-Muslims, but perhaps other groups as well. Because one attitude that exists in the field is that the Ottoman state was bureaucratic, it was immense, it was huge, not at all Oriental, despotic, and decrepit and all these things. So we think totally the opposite. But when I look at circa 1700 stuff that has to do with Armenians, a lot of it is filled with stuff that I'm convinced is just errors. And given the commonness with which people talk about bribery, what I'm thinking is, I mean, I don't think that the Qadi is going to bring together a team of people to go and examine Armenian books and then file a proper report with the Divan Humayun, which is going to then be reflected in the Mühime Defterleri. So I'm saying all this because I would think that if either the central administration just needed some excuse to do something, or if anti-Catholic Armenians wanted to motivate the central administration to do something, then it would make sense for them to use a discourse that people truly or cared about or could feign to care about, which is the provision of sacred texts.
So it's a rejoinder. No, sorry.
There was a question.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah.
It was just to follow up on this, in the publication of Tatavatsi's Girkat Smanso, they leave out the section on against Islam because they said they're afraid that the Ottoman authorities are going to crack down on them. So somebody is checking, and it would have been, I mean, I don't know how many Ottoman authorities could read Tatavatsi's Girkat Smanso, so it would have had to have been an insider who ratted them out and denounced them, right? And there also may have been a different status for, I think, I'm totally out of my field, but I would presume they were more suspicious of printed material as opposed to manuscripts. Just by
I don't know about that last part personally, but for the first part, I think you wouldn't need to have had a bureaucrat who understood Karagan Hayat, and you just needed to know that a Catholic might raise a trust.
Just ask something that just is kind of coming up in the various comments, and maybe Sergio is also to what you were pointing out. Is it not the case that a lot of these texts, and as I'm also going through multiple sort of copies of texts from the earlier periods in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, what I'm observing is that it's not so much that they religiously want to verbatim and word by word copy. What I tend to observe, and that's sort of a question maybe perhaps for correction too from your experience, it's taking something from the past, and what the role of the Bach puppet is to actually make it relevant for their people. So yes, is it changing things? Sure, but it's really also doing Bach puppet too, which is, let me take this text and make it relevant for my people, because otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah.
What? I mean, again, we have copies of Basil's, 6 Days of Creation, and then actually later on, 15th, 16th, 17th century commentaries insert people of the Armenian tradition that are nowhere from the earlier context. So then maybe I wonder if in terms of how to approach some of these changes has to do with that style of passing something forward from the original context to the current one that's being.
And that's definitely with the non-canonical works. They do that all the time. I think you're absolutely correct. Then there's some where it's just more specific, where they put anti-Chalcedonian statements into the people who are not anti-Chalcedonian. I mean, they're just like more, I would say, directly polemical changes that happen in some texts. But you're absolutely correct that a lot of it is making relevant something that may not have its relevancy. They're not seeing it as perverting a text; they're seeing it as like updating.
Updating.
Yeah.
So that, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of also like Matteo Droazzi, he's taking the Desert Fathers.
Yeah.
But when I compare it to the original work, it's like, this is not anything will be bad with this, you know, this is actually a lot of additions of what the Armenian thought of that period is, which then actually gives us insight about their world.
Yeah.
What it is
Yes.
they're saying and doing then. Just a quick comment about Naregazzi and the Jesus Forti, if I may.
Yeah.
If you're interested in a more of a closer study of Jesus Forti, Dr. Roberta Urban just gave 4 lectures on it, and it's on YouTube. So feel free to check those out. It will be really helpful, perhaps if you are wanting to kind of understand more of that contextualized in its sort of original context, but also the unfolding. But I wonder, like, even in the Vatican now, Naregazzi is canonized, commemorated, but Shirahadi is not. We're in that process. As of 2023, we're working towards it, but I don't think it's finalized in that way. So could that mean something? Again, I'm doing reverse history here, like looking at something that has already happened now to something perhaps dealing with what these figures were for the people in the 17th, 18th century.
No. The Mechitarists are obsessed with the Shonari. So they always always speak fondly of Shonari because it's considered as the forerunner of Armenian Catholic dialogue and because of its ecumenical letters, etc. So yeah, it's highly esteemed, at least from an Armenian Catholic point of view.
Sorry. I just had one quick question for Bogdan. I was curious, so in your other work, and you use the word today as well of dissimulation, we have Catholic figures dressing up like Vartabeds and going out and talking to people. And they live in the community as a Vartabed. It's like, I learned about it from you a while and stuff. So I was wondering, like, is a term maybe like performativity or performance studies have anything to do with you? Listening to your talk about the play, we're also dressing up as Armenian historical figures and getting people to feel feelings and experience something. It's like this other way of relating to people. Is there a connection at all? I mean, it's kind of on the out there between these different kind of performances, or are they really different from each other?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I feel like I have like a very very vague answer to this, probably. Maybe related to the sort of the zeitgeist of the Baroque age in which it was all happening. When we see that the like religious dissimulation was actually very widespread, not only among Catholic missionaries but also among Armenian pilgrims or other figures from other religions. So it was a very sort of common trope and way of sort of navigating the new confessional world at the time. But yeah, but in this case, the simulation that I was talking about in my other paper that was about Galano, who lived in Istanbul, I'm now sort of slightly reconsidering my interpretation of his actions, because I think he might have tried to portray himself as dissimulating to get away with this in the eyes of the Roman authorities. I think he might have been more sincere about his embracing Armenian sort of identity than I used to think about this. And it's always really hard to tell how much people seriously took these different identities that they were trying to inhabit. But I think there is this sort of theatrical element to all of this. Maybe it's part of the sort of the Baroque sort of cultural idiom that we can see in other media, but also in other sort of forms of art and other fields of cultural life. But I still, thinking on it, I have to sort of develop it into a more coherent answer.
So I think we need a
It would be nice to have a biography of Ganon if you want to write one.
Oh yeah, that's true. Well, there's
There's Merujan Karapetian who's like publishing every year a piece on him and his disciples. So yeah, apart from him,
it's already reaching like 200 pages, but it's like all in articles, so it's going to be a book soon. I think that's it. Yeah, I think this is a good place to end this workshop. I thank you all very much for participating, for joining us for panels, and thank you, and hope we stay in touch.